humans are wired for status. They're not wired for happiness. I think it's true just from an evolutionary perspective of like, it's a competition for resources. Happiness does not play into that. What matters is that you get the land, you get the mate, you get the job, whatever it's going to be. And you really have to fight back against the natural urges that you're moving towards. So and the next door is the bookstore and your office?
Yeah, I'll show you the bookstore and the record store, and then upstairs is offices.
Yeah.
And then in the back is where we do like some of the Daily Stoic fulfillment, and then all the e-commerce for the bookstore. And then this is the studio. I haven't figured out what to do in the front, and then it's going to be my wife's office, and then like the production stuff.
Do you work here every day, or do you work from home?
Most
mostly?
days. Yeah. I don't really work from home anymore because I don't know about you, but when you start taking your kids to school, it's like you're already leaving the house.
Yeah.
So leaving, I just come here.
Cool. Love it.
I didn't know you grew up. Where did you grow up?
Tahoe.
You grew up in Tahoe?
Yep. Truckee.
Okay. So I grew up in Sacramento, and
that's amazing. I actually, to make it more specific, then I grew up for half my childhood in Placerville.
Okay.
And then Truckee after that.
So I lived in we are in Placer County technically, like on the very far edges, and then my parents had a little cabin on the West Shore, so I would go to Homewood almost every weekend.
Yeah, so cool. I'm sure that was probably the same time.
Yeah, when I saw it in the book, I was like, wait, I don't know why I thought you were like an East Coast person or something. I don't know why.
I live in Seattle now. Yeah, I moved there 4 years ago. Before that, my wife and I were in DC for 8 years.
Okay,
that's probably.
But yeah, I wasn't thinking like Tahoe. Yeah. And then this all probably that we both grew up. I was snowboarding. It sounded like you were skiing. This sounds much fancier now than it was then, because when I was growing up, going to ski resort was like $30 a day, $40 a day.
Yes.
Now it's like $250. I don't know how anyone does it.
It's really sad that it went from you could be a lower middle class family and take your whole family skiing.
Yeah.
And now it's to take a family of 5 skiing for one day.
Yeah.
For one day is probably $1,200.
Yeah, it's
once you get everything in.
A ski pass at Homewood for a kid was like $300 or $400.
Yeah.
And then you could go as many times as you wanted.
Yes.
So yeah, it was a very middle class activity. I'm trying to think what an equivalent activity of it is now.
I think a lot of that is for if you're in like competitive traveling soccer or lacrosse or whatever it is.
Sure.
Then it gets pricey. I'm actually going to Tahoe tomorrow with my son. I'm going to go skiing with him. We're flying into Sacramento, and at Sierra Tahoe, which is my home mountain growing up. And when I was growing up in the 90s, a day ticket was $25.
Yeah.
And now it's $175.
Yeah.
And granted, I think a lot of what's happened is most ski resorts used to be owned by families. Yes. And there were rich families that just owned it because it was cool. None of them made any money.
Right.
Now they're all owned by corporations. And corporations were like, well, we got to make money. So everyone just jacked up their prices by literally fourfold. Yeah,
we're getting a little far afield from what we should be talking about. But I was thinking, like, everyone's talking about inflation and then they talk about just brands jacking up prices. I think it's also what brands have realized. As you get more and more data, you realize what the brands and big companies have realized is that they're not, that they have sort of, that there's a customer that is not price sensitive at all.
Yeah.
And so just like the reason first class seats in an airplane become more and more expensive is that they'll essentially pay an unlimited amount for that thing. And so it just jacks all the price. Instead, because you can't do, well, it's expensive for some people and cheap for some people.
Yeah.
It's something like skiing. It just has to be expensive for everyone. And they just jack the price up because they know that the people who are going to do it anyway are just going to do it regardless of what it costs. There's some people, if you have a $9 million house, you're not even thinking about what a ski lift ticket costs. So you just do it.
There's a lot of those items too, where if the market is rich people,
yes,
the inflation rate is very likely going to track the growth of their assets over time, not the general inflation rate.
Yes.
So what has the stock market gone up in the last 15 years? About 12% per year.
Yeah.
What is the inflation rate for skiing, education, those things that pandering to rich people? It's going to match that level, not the overall inflation rate.
No, that's a really interesting way to think about it. Yeah. So if you have a middle class hobby that's also aspirational, you're thinking about it what it was to you then, but then as the difference in income inequality has gone up and up, that activity that used to be accessible to you is now insanely inaccessible.
Yes, completely. It's sad.
What do you feel like you learned doing something like that that's translated in your life? I mean, skiing. Like I think about, I got a lot of independence out of it. Like the idea that my parents would just sort of let me go on a mountain all day and then be like, we'll see you at 4:00.
Yeah.
There's not that many things that kids do like that anymore.
It was great. And it also, we had a team and we were traveling around, but it's not a team sport. It's an individual sport.
Sure.
And it was, I think that was really good for me to just be like, you're on your own here. You can't rely on your teammates to make the goal. You're like, either you suck or you're good, and it's all on you.
Yeah.
And to learn that independence mixed with, as you just mentioned, like a lot of these races where we would go to like New Zealand in our summer, their winter. We were 15, 16, and technically our coaches were watching us, but they were at the bar. They were not. And then so we were 15, 16, thrown into New Zealand or the middle of Colorado and just been like, go have some fun. And that level of independence was extraordinary. So I feel like we grew up very quickly doing that because we were not in high school. We were not being driven around by our parents. We were just wandering around by ourselves at that age. And so that level of independence was great.
Although it almost killed you.
It almost killed me.
Yeah.
So growing up in Squaw, in Tahoe, one day it was February 2001, and my two best friends, Brendan Allen and Brian Richmond, we were skiing together as we had since our childhood. And we would ski out of bounds, which is you duck under the ropes that say do not cross, but that's amazing skiing. Out of bounds, there's no chairlift at the bottom. So we would hitchhike back. We would ski until it spit us out on this backcountry road, and we'd hitchhike back. As we're doing this one day in February 2001, the three of us are skiing down, and we triggered a small avalanche.
Yeah.
And it like came up to our knees. It wasn't that big of a deal. You kind of just like ride around. We were like, woo. We got to the bottom and we literally like high-fived, like, oh, did you see that avalanche? So cool. And we hitchhike back. Yeah. We get back down to the bottom of the mountain, and Brendan and Brian say, hey, let's go do it again. Like, let's go do that run again. For whatever reason, I said, I don't want to do it. Yeah. I was like, I think hitchhiking freaked me out. I always thought we were going to be abducted. And so I said, hey, let's do this. You guys go do it again. And I will, like, rather than hitchhiking back, I'll drive my truck around, pick you up, and we'll drive back. Said, great, parted ways. Brendan and Brian went skiing. I went to go get my truck so I could go pick them up. 20 minutes later, I go to where I'm going to meet them to pick them up, and they weren't there. And I didn't think much of it. I thought that they probably had hitchhiked back, and like they just got tired of waiting for me, so they left. So I drive back down to our locker room at the mountain. I expected to find them there, but they weren't there either. And I still didn't think that much of it. Yeah. Like people, we didn't have cell phones back then. Yeah. And so people were comfortable being out of touch. The hours went on, and eventually later that afternoon, Brian's mom called me at home. And she said, hey, Brian never showed up for work today. Do you know where he is? Yeah. And I told her, I said, we skied out of bounds. I was going to pick them up. They never showed up. Nobody's seen them since. And we put together that there's a problem here. Yeah. Several hours later, we got the police involved, missing persons report. We eventually got search and rescue involved. When search and rescue entered the out of bounds area where I told them we skied, they instantly found the fresh scars of a massive avalanche that had just occurred hours before. Yeah. So search and rescue knows that this is, they understand what happened here. Yeah. After about 9 hours of searching, the search dogs homed in on a spot in this avalanche debris field, and rescuers found Brendan and Brian buried under 6 feet of snow. And it didn't really dawn on me until a little while later, like how close I was to going with them on that second run. Sure. And that if I did, the odds that I would have died are 100%. It was massive. You can't outrun these things. And then so like it's this weird thing of the most important decision I ever made in my entire life. Yeah. Was this brainless, dumb decision to not go with them. And I didn't weigh the pros and cons. I didn't think it through. It was just like, oh, you guys go do it. I'm going to go do something else. Right. And nothing else, no other decision I've ever made matters more than that. And I think everybody, including you, everybody has had one of those decisions, at least one of those. Of course. A brainless decision that literally saved your life.
Hey, it's Ryan. Real brief interruption, which I was just thinking of because we have such a great guest on today talking about money and finance. We were just going through a credit card statement for Daily Stoic, and we noticed all these different charges. Didn't know what they were from. We didn't know who signed up for them. So I actually used today's sponsor to solve that problem. I'm talking about Rocket Money. Rocket Money is this awesome personal finance app that helps you manage your money, manage your expenses, lower your bills, cancel subscriptions. With Rocket Money, you can cancel unwanted subscriptions because it safely and securely identifies recurring charges and cancels unwanted subscriptions for you. You can even cancel within the app with just a couple of taps. No worries about customer service calls. And we found this literally saved us thousands of dollars every single month. Rocket Money has helped save its customers an average of $740 a year, with over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. To save more and spend less, join over 5 million members using Rocket Money today. Just go to rocketmoney.com/dailystoic or just click the link in the description below to get started. And you can unlock even more features with their premium service. That's rocketmoney.com/dailystoic. And now back to the clip. We should talk about that. But one of the things that's interesting to me is I think people have this, we were just talking about like what your parents used to allow you to do. We have this sense that like parents are way too protective these days. But I think it's also a reaction when you look back, each generation looks back to things that their parents allowed them to do. And you're like, that's insane.
Yeah.
Why would you do that?
Yeah.
Why would you allow your kids to be in a position where as idiots, they could make stupid decisions that could potentially change the course of their life one direction or another. Yeah. And so on the one hand, the world gets safer and safer because things get taken off the table, but it's also because each generation, you have more and more data and horror stories about how easily it could go the other way.
How fragile the world is and just hanging by a thread with everybody. Yeah. And it's not just true for individuals, but like the macro level too, how much the world hangs by a thread. I use a story in Same as Ever about during the Revolutionary War, during the Battle of Long Island, George Washington and his troops were cornered by the British. Yeah. And all the British had to do was sail up the East River in New York. They would have wiped them out. The war would have been over. No United States. Yeah. That didn't happen because the wind was not blowing in the right direction that night. Right. So they could not sail up the East River. And David McCullough, the great historian, was asked, he said, if the wind was blowing in the other direction that night, would there be a United States of America? Yeah. Without hesitation, he says no. Right. Never would have happened. So the entire existence of the country was just relied on which direction the winds were blowing on some random night in August 1770, whatever it was. Yeah. And so I think when you hear enough of those stories, you realize like how fragile all of this is. Yes. And then to me, this was kind of the core of Same as Ever. It's like, stop pretending that you think you can know what's going to happen next in the future. Sure. Because it all hangs by a thread in your individual life and at the macro level. Like the details of what's going to happen next at the macro level are completely unpredictable.
Yes. Yeah, it is weird, right? So there's sort of a paradox in the book, and I think in life, which is on the one hand, history is the same thing happening over and over and over again. Nothing changes, right? And then it's also true that each one of those historical events could have easily been something else. Like I think David McCullough said the one thing that you can't forget as a biographer, as a historian, is the people living those events didn't know how it was going to go. Yeah. And he said that it always could have been otherwise. Yes. And so that's the weird thing is that there's this sort of deterministic, like we're all just along for the rideness of life and history and fate. And then also this kind of both great man of history, like one person makes one decision, and then also the wind or the elements or the football bounces one direction, and that changes the course of everything.
Yeah, it's tough. You're right. There's a great book that I love. I think it's the greatest economic book ever written. It's called The Great Depression, A Diary. It was written by this bankruptcy attorney in the 1930s during the Depression. And true to what you just said, when he's writing this diary in real time, he doesn't know that the Great Depression is going to end. Yeah. And it was very common back then to think it would not end. Yeah. And a lot of countries in Europe at this time embraced fascism in order to get out of that. Sure. And you have all these things like in the 1930s in America, good people like pondering in these diaries, like maybe fascism is the right way to go. Maybe that's the right thing to do. Because they didn't know what was going to happen next. Right. And it's fascinating to read that relative to every other history book where the author knows how it ends. Yeah. And that is going to color what they write in every single aspect. It was the same in World War II. You know, now we know that Japan surrendered in 1945. Yes. That was not a foregone conclusion. Yes. We were going to invade, the United States was going to invade the Japanese mainlands in 1945. And there were estimates that could take years in addition to that and kill maybe 500,000 Americans in the process. Yeah. So there's all these alternative histories that easily could have occurred.
Yeah. So you have there's this kind of, it's a powerlessness and then also a very empowering idea that history can turn on a single decision. Your life can turn on a single decision. And then also the idea that you're in control is preposterous.
Yes. I also think about like in our lifetimes, more modern, virtually everything that has occurred that's important, that's occurred in the last 25 years in America is tied to September 11th. Whether that was like monetary policy that led to the housing bubble or the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that led to budget deficits, so many things tie back to that.
Yeah.
Then you think, what if at Boston Logan Airport on that morning, the guy working at TSA security would have said, hey, you can't bring that box cutter on the flight.
Yeah.
And just like wiped everything out.
Sure.
Everything from monetary policy to recessions to wars would have been different.
Yeah.
Like there's not a single thing in America that would have been the same today if 9/11 did not have happened.
Well, so Admiral McRaven was sitting in that chair yesterday morning, and he was saying he was at the White House when Condoleezza Rice came out into the hallway to tell them that they'd made the decision to invade Iraq. And he was saying, there wasn't any like music playing. Like there was no sense that that was a dramatic, pivotal moment. Like obviously it wasn't something anyone was taking lightly. And they knew, of course, it was significant. But he was saying, we were talking about, it's like, if that's a movie, depending on when that movie's for, at the moment it's they probably would have thought of it as this dramatic, epic moment.
Yeah.
And then now we understand it as a tragic, foreboding moment.
Yeah.
But in the moment, you don't know. You just think you're making
like a
a
business decision that somebody whispered to each other in the White House.
Yeah. And there's probably, if you've ever made a life-changing or what you think is a significant decision, there's just this sort of getting excitement of just like, we're going to do this thing.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's the same decision. And I think this is important. Gives you a sense of history. It's the same decision your family made. It's the same energy your family had. Are we going to buy this car?
Yes.
You know what I mean? Or are we going to move? Or should I take this job? And the people who are making the decisions at the level of like, are we going to invade this country? Or are we going to launch this bomb? Or are we going to put in place announce this economic policy? It's not that different. It is different, but it's not that different. It's just fucking people using imperfect information.
Trying to manage uncertainty.
Yes.
And that's like, yeah. And I feel like that, you're right. Like when I think about my wife and I's decision to have kids, to buy this house, to move to this city, most of those were more or less snap decisions in the moment. And I want to think that like we'd thought these things out and planned alternative, like weighed the pros and cons. The truth is we didn't. It was like, let's try this one.
Well, that's the tricky thing. Mark Manson's talked about that idea of like hell yes or hell no, or fuck yes or fuck no. And I think it's good. It's a good rubric if you're just like, do I want to have lunch with this person, or do I want to like go on this trip people are going, like really minor things. But when I actually think about the decisions that changed my life, when I think about dropping out of college, I think about the decision to write my first book, when I think about this investment or that, like big things that I've done, the decision to do this bookstore, I was not anywhere close to fuck yes is the greatest idea.
Totally.
It's obviously going to work. And in fact, that kind of certainty is probably a sign that you're a maniac.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like
totally
it's almost always 51-49.
Yes. I did not want to write Psychology Money, and I put it off for years and years and years. And even when I finally signed a contract to do it and I had 1 year to write it, I basically started writing it 10 months into that process. It was just delay. I didn't want to do it. And of course, looking back, it was the most meaningful thing I ever did in my career. And I did not want to do it. And then I could probably name a couple other things that I was so adamant that I wanted to do and were the right decisions, and ended, in hindsight, I shouldn't have done.
Right. I remember my agent had the idea for the Daily Stoic. I've had the idea for all of my books except for Daily Stoic. And my agent said, here I'm thinking like there should be this book of Stoicism that people could start with. He had done a couple of daily books when he was a publisher. Like he did the Daily Drucker and a few other books. He's like, I think you should do it. And he's like, I think it'll be your best-selling book, which that's not how I make decisions about what I do or not. Like, was this going to be my best-selling or most, financially remunerative thing? But I was like, okay. Like, I you know what I mean? Like I didn't believe him in the sense, like that seemed like hyperbole to me. And then in retrospect, it was true or close to true.
Yeah.
But what happens then when you hear something like that, or you make decisions like that, then you can take a really wicked lesson from that, which is that the prediction was correct. Mm-hmm. But in fact, the prediction and the outcome are two independent things.
Yeah.
There's some correlation there, but there's not necessarily causation. And you can learn the wrong thing from having been quote unquote right.
When you wrote Daily Stoic, in your mind, what did you think it was going to do in terms of sales and response?
I mean, I can remember very vividly. I wrote the whole book. It's an unusual project to do a daily book, because you're just doing a bunch of you're not thinking about it as a book until later. You have to write. Yeah. You're not like, what do I want to do on January 2nd? And then what's March 14th, right? You can't, that's weird. There's no correlation between the entry and the day at first. So first I just had to sit down and first I had to pick a like 366 quotes. Then I had to write 366 entries, and then I arranged them, and then I came up with themes. So it was kind of, it wasn't until later that I even got a sense of like what the book was. But then I remember the day before I was supposed to submit it, I sent it to the editor that I work with, not at my publisher. And I was like, is this even good? I was like, should I do this? I was like, I don't know how I feel about it. Like, I feel weird about it. Like, I wasn't, because it was so different, and it wasn't a style I was super familiar with. And and he was like, I don't know. Like, he wasn't like, no, it's the best thing you've ever done. So there was, what I remember from the writing to the up until publication, and then even like for a while after publication, I remember the ambiguity of it.
Yeah.
And I try to stay in the ambiguity of it, because that's authentic and real and representative of where I was at the time. Not, okay, it's spent 200 or 300 consecutive weeks on bestseller lists since, or it sold millions of copies since. It became this whole other thing with the email and the videos and podcasts. I try to remember what I thought about it at the time, because that's true. And what is true after is independent, or it's a made up narrative that connects a different conception with a different impression now. Because one, I think it's not honest, so I try not to do it that way. But two, it can bestow upon yourself a sense of prescience or brilliance, or whatever, that's not conducive to being right again in the future.
Yeah, I think it's very true in venture capital as well.
Yes.
That the companies that make it and go on to be huge, at the time when the VC made that investment, it was not clear at all that this was going to be a winner.
Right.
And there were several companies in their portfolio that the VC was like, this company is got it, and they go out of business. Yeah. It's always the case. When Uber went out to raise money, I mean, it sounded like a joke.
Yes.
It's the same, like most of these companies that do well sound like a joke when you pitch them at first.
Yes.
Uber is like, we think everyone should be a taxi driver.
Yeah.
And you're just going to get in a car with it. It sounds ridiculous when you go out to pitch it.
Well, people do this. They go, oh, well, the first time I laid eyes on my wife or my husband, I knew that was and no, you had and look, there are some people, and there's documentary evidence of it, which is, that's unique and weird. But no, what you had was the same flash of attraction that humans have when they find people attractive.
Yeah.
And then it evolved into what it is now, and you're finding a way to make that consistent, as opposed to something that changed over time, or grew into something like, and I do think it's important as you think about your success, that you tell yourself like the humblest version of that possible.
Yeah.
Like with The Obstacle Is the Way. When The Obstacle Is the Way came out, first off, it didn't hit any bestseller list the week it came out. It probably sold 3,000 or 4,000 copies. No one was disappointed with it. Like, I don't want to present it like it was some failure, but like it was, like what most books do. Yeah. And then I had this idea that there was this thing called BookBub, which had come out then, which is like an email that sends out a blast about deeply discounted ebooks every day. And it had just sort of come out, and a bunch of people I knew were using it, and I was like, let's wait a little bit, and then let's discount the ebook. Let's do a 1 week promo where we discount the ebook from whatever they were, $9.99 then to $1.99. And so the publisher did that, I don't know, 2-3 months into the thing. And I don't know why, no one's explained it to me since, but what happened was Amazon just like left it there. Like it just stayed
at $1.99
or $2.99 at some deeply discounted price. And I remember going, are you going to ask Amazon to increase it? And they were like, what's weird is like they're choosing to do this, and they're paying the
full
same
rate. Yeah.
the same. It's not a discounted royalty to you, so you shouldn't care. And I was like, okay, and it stayed that way for 11 months, and
Probably increased sales of the physical book too.
well, yeah, of course. But so when you look at it, it's like it came out, it did like this, and then it was kind of like this, and then there's this sort of spike from the ebook, and then it kind of just went like that.
Yeah.
It was so what happened was an idea which is not super marketable, an obscure book about ancient philosophy, or a book about an obscure school of ancient philosophy comes out. And then it's subsidized by the biggest retailer in the world,
Right.
which creates, which lowers the barrier to discovery, and it gives that book a chance.
Yeah.
So that's ultimately why everything I've done since had a better chance of succeeding, because I got that thing. And so the lesson I try to take from The Obstacle Is the Way is not, I'm a genius, I wrote a book that popularized this school of philosophy and sold lots of copies. I go, actually, I wrote this book, and then I understood it had a certain barrier to entry, and then I proposed a unique marketing idea that happened to be far more lucky or successful than I could have ever imagined.
Yeah.
And that's where the success
Where it
comes
came from. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in general, most book sales, particularly for big sellers, come from word of mouth. And therefore, like, what you need to do early on is just get it in as many hands as you possibly can. And if it's a good book, as your books are, like any book that sells that much is a good book.
Yeah.
But you get it into people's hands
Yes.
so that they can go recommend it to their friends. And it's just like a virus. If for every person who buys your book, if they recommend it to more than one other person, it's just going to go and go and go and go.
Right.
And then so I think like early on, it's just like waving your hands as much as you can, getting into as many hands, discounting it to $1.99 so that those people can go recommend it to their friends and their siblings, whatnot.
Well, I've been very cognizant of it, because when I was at American Apparel, what I ultimately realized is, so Dove, who's the founder of this company, the idea on its face is absurd, right? He's like, I'm going to make clothes in the US. They're not going to have branding on it. I'm going to run my own stores. I'm going to pay the workers a fair wage. All these things that at each step of the way, people were like, that's a bad idea. That is economically impossible. That's not how we do things. And then it succeeded, right? And so what he took from that, what a lot of entrepreneurs take from that kind of success is, I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm a genius. I saw what other people didn't see, right? And so that's the curse. That's why so many successful people fail to replicate that success. It's ego, it's hubris, it's this sort of narrative fallacy of, I saw it, and so I am a seer.
Yeah.
And then that's what kills you.
Almost the worst thing that can happen to you in investing is you're 19 years old, you open up a Robinhood account, and you do really well.
Yes.
Because then you're like, I'm the next George Soros.
Yeah.
I'm good at trading options on penny stocks.
Yeah.
It's the worst thing. It's the worst outcome you can have.
Yeah.
One of the best things you can have is you open up a Robinhood account and you lose half your money. And then you're like, okay, this can be
need to figure out
dangerous.
the
I need to
fundamentals.
figure out how this actually works, because what
Yes.
I just did doesn't work.
Yes.
And it's this weird, I think a lot of kids in 2021 who opened Robinhood's accounts and doubled their money in a month, day trading SPACs and whatnot.
Yeah.
That's like the worst thing you could possibly happen to them, because every one of them thinks they know what they're doing at this point.
Yeah, it's the same if you're like genetically gifted in athletics early on, right? You think you're good as opposed to you have an advantage.
You have an advantage,
And so you don't actually develop the fundamental skill or the mastery of the specific sport, how it works. You don't develop the ability to see the love of the game. What you love is being great at the game.
Yeah.
Right. I was talking to Shaka Smart about this, and he was saying, he's the head coach at Marquette. He was at Texas, and he was saying that, the athletes say stuff like, I don't love it anymore. And he's like, what you love is being great at it. You love being the best. You never loved it. You loved it being easy. And so if you don't, being successful early at something develops this sort of false sense of what that thing is.
What it is. Yeah.
Whereas if you're bad at it for a while and you stick with it, then you actually probably do love it. You're loving it independent of the rewards, which is ultimately where you want to be. Whatever you do it because you like doing it. And then the fact that you're paid well for it or recognized for it or celebrated for it, that's like this little bonus.
There's this quote from George Soros where somebody asked him, he says, George, how old were you when you learned that you love investing?
Yeah.
And he says, love investing? He's like, I hate investing. I'm just good at it.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably why he quit once he got rich enough too.
Yeah.
Another thing on this topic that I always think about, so I grew up ski racing in Lake Tahoe. The two greatest ski racers from my era were Lindsey Vonn and Julia Mancuso. Both of them, by age 5, you could tell where they were going. It was obvious. And by the time they were 10, it was like, they're going to be the best in the world. They were a million miles ahead of everybody else.
Yeah.
Another amazing skier from my era was Ted Ligety, who up until he was about 18 years old was good, not great.
Yeah.
He was like a good regional skier. And then he became, by the time he was 25, the greatest giant slalom skier to ever exist in history. And that, like, I always think about that. Like, did Julia and Lindsay have just an absolute natural talent? So the time they were 5, it was just like, they were so good. And was Ted more just like hard work? He just figured it out.
Sure.
And like the different skills. And both of those are like really admirable skills. But it's, I remember from Julia and Lindsay, I remember always thinking, if you're going to be a good skier, it's obvious by the time you're 5.
Yeah.
But then Ted just like completely broke that mold and showed like, no, you can become great 10 years into what you're doing.
Yeah, or that it's basically a crapshoot for everyone.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking it has to be a certain way, you're sort of missing the point.
And I think Ted gave so many 18-year-olds hope that like, no, like I'm in ski racing for 10 years and I'm not that great.
Sure.
But that was true for Ted too, and he became the best in the world.
One of the things you talk about in the book that I thought was really interesting that I don't think we talk enough about, especially people who write books for people who want to be successful, is that a good chunk of these people are like just maniacs.
Yeah.
Like they're either fundamentally broken or wounded in some way, or that actually the success is a byproduct of some profound dysfunction, and that you would not want to be these people at all. And in fact, they're not really these people. They can't help themselves.
Yes. I mean, that's true. The most stunning example is Elon Musk,
Yeah.
where it's like he has achieved some of the greatest success of any entrepreneur. He's going to Mars, he's building cars and whatnot. But the same personality characteristics that let him do that also have these negative sides that people hate.
Yeah.
His views on Twitter, his manners, whatever you want to call it. But that's all the same personality.
Yeah.
And I think what people want is they're like, no, we want Elon to be the crazy engineer, but we want him to be nice and civil and polite. And you're like, no, that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's the same person.
Yeah.
Bill Gates was the same. Walt Disney was the same. Steve Jobs was the same. They're all maniacs at their core. That's why they were successful.
Yes.
And there's this other element that comes from it. So you could say, like, if you read Steve Jobs' biography, he was an absolute devil of a boss. You did not want to work for him.
Right.
But that was why he was successful.
Yes.
So you can't separate those things. And I think a big takeaway from this is like, be careful when you are admiring someone.
Yeah.
If you're like, I want to be an engineer like Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Well, you're like, well, the only reason he was able to do that is because he's also has this kind of a jerk side that's attached to it. And you can't separate that.
Well, also that it's not a choice. Do you know what I
Yes.
mean? It's like saying I want to be like someone that's 7 foot tall, or I want to be like someone that has cancer. Like, you know what I mean? Like, these are not things that they had anything to do with. And in fact, it's on net probably more negative than positive.
Yes. I also think if you take someone like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, if they, let's just say that Mark Zuckerberg inherited $1 billion when he was 18, hypothetically, that would not have slowed him down at all. I think he still would have been as successful as he was. They were not motivated by money. They were like, I have to build this product. I have to go out and do this. And I think a lot of those people, even today, when they're worth $100 billion or more, they wake up every morning terrified. And like, I have so many problems I need to go solve, and they have to do it. Musk gave this interview like a month ago where he was like, you might think you want to be me, the richest man in the world, but you don't. Like, it's a mess inside of this head. You do not want to be inside of this head. And I think it's true for all of them.
Yeah, there's a Wright Thompson profile of Michael Jordan. It's called Michael Jordan at 50. And it's one of the most haunting, incredible pieces of journalism you'll ever read. And it's basically, at this point, I think Michael Jordan is basically just the GM of the Hornets, or the owner / GM of the Hornets. And, you know, you would expect he's got the greatest life in the world. You know, he's made this greatest basketball player of all time, biggest shoe brand, owns a basketball team, can do whatever he wants. But he's sort of just haunted by this ability, the sense that he can't do the one thing he's meant to do, which is play basketball.
Yeah.
And that he had the part that made him great, but also made him a maniac, was this competitiveness, this need to win at everything. And he says something to Wright Thompson like, you get this gift, and it makes you great, but you can't turn it off.
Yeah.
Right. And it sounds like something that would be in like a Shakespearean play or in a fable by Aesop, where the gift comes with the inability to not utilize the gift or not maximize the gift. So it's actually a curse.
Yeah.
And he just can't not be competitive. And so, yeah, when you're a professional basketball player at 26, being competitive is an asset, right? Because makes you better, you compete for a living. But now you're a 50-year-old billionaire who should be enjoying everything that you have, but you can't because all you're doing is comparing yourself to other people and impotent to express the competitiveness that you feel in a reality or a world where you don't have the ability to be what you want to be.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's especially true in sports where you can't do it forever.
Yeah.
Warren Buffett's been investing for 75 years.
Yeah.
You can do that forever.
Yeah.
But what was it like when Kobe retired, when Jordan retired, when LeBron is going to retire someday?
Yeah.
What do they do the next morning? I imagine that is a sense of torture, waking up and saying,
it's like a living
realizing
death.
you can't be doing what you were born to do.
Yeah.
That's got to be a really tough thing.
Well, but the problem is you weren't born to do it. Do you know what I mean? Like the amount of therapy and work you have to do as a person to go, I'm not born to do anything. I don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the asset is not just the genetic ability, or the blessing is the genetic ability and the skill and all the stuff. And then the curse is the belief, what we make up, which is like to be worthwhile as a person.
Yeah.
I have to maximize this gift.
That's it.
And you don't. I mean, it's good to, and it feels good to, but you don't. You don't have to do anything.
I really admire athletes and business people and authors who quit while they're ahead.
Yeah.
And it seems like a weird thing to admire, but I really like people who are like, I'm at the top of my game and I have so much more potential in front of me, but I'm gonna pass the baton to somebody else, and I'm gonna go spend more time with my family, whatever it be.
Yeah.
Like I think that's so admirable to do, and it shows that like they're in control of that demon inside of their head. That I think probably people like Jordan and Kobe and LeBron are not in control of it. The demon is running them. But people like Jerry Seinfeld who are like, I'm just gonna quit this show. It's on top of the world, but like I've had enough. I think they're in perfect control over that demon inside of their head.
Well, you realize that that's a rarer thing, right? So being 0.001% in your profession is a very rare thing. And then among those people, like people who are considered great, or not even great, just or a GOAT, like just people who are considered elite at their thing, how many of them have the ability to turn it up or down intentionally? And more rarely turn it down or walk away or feel good or be enough or have happiness inside it. That is the far rarer thing.
Yeah.
There's ultimately there's lots of people who become generals, who become billionaires, who become, MVPs or champions or bestsellers. Like ultimately it feels rare because at any one moment there's not that many people doing it. But every year there's more of those people. So cumulatively lots of people have done it through history. How many of them have had some semblance of control over it and themselves while they did it? That is the rarer thing.
It's like the 0.001 of the 0.001.
Yeah.
Like they're already in the 0.001 by their talent.
Yes.
But then only 0.001 of them will be able to like take control over the demon and say, I want to quit while I can.
Yeah. I mean, look, so you sold millions of books, right? You put out a book, and first off, to write a book is a rare thing, right? Then to write a book that sells, it's a rare thing. Then to write a book that sort of reaches escape velocity, right? Which you've done, I've done, that's a rare thing. And then for how many people can that be, what percentage of those people does it not become this sort of thing that either they're always trying to surpass, right? Or, this thing that they're trying to do more and more of. For how many of them are they just like, that's what I did, and I keep doing it because I love doing it, but it's not a great burden in some way. It's actually it's surprisingly rare thing.
Two things
come
to mind here.
It's hard work.
Yeah, it's tough. Paul Graham's idea of keep your identity small is really important. Anytime in life where you say, I am a blank, whatever it is, I am a Republican, I am a best-selling author, I am a blank, you are tying yourself to that, to something that may not last. And if it doesn't last, then your identity is broken once it's gone. That's tough. The other thing I read recently from Arthur Brooks, which I thought was interesting, was don't keep your trophies on display because those are your past successes. And if you are literally walking into your office every day and being like, I used to be great. This trophy shows I used to be good. And then then it prevents you from moving on to some other phase of your life. It's a reminder of what you used to be. And that can be a tough thing for people.
I don't know if I totally agree with that, because I could see a world where you're like, I did it. I feel good. That's the recognition of having done it.
Yeah.
And then a version where you're like, it's Jeff Bezos said, it's day one. It's always day one. That's also a way to keep yourself from never feeling like you did it, which you did do it. It's not day one. The company's been around for 15 years. Pat yourself on the back. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I can see a world where...
I can see both ends of it. I do think there probably are people in sports, whatever it would be, who are haunted by their trophies as a reminder of the body that they used to have, the skill that they used to have that they don't anymore.
It's a first world. I mean, I remember the first time I was like profiled in something, or the first time I hit a bestseller list, and then also like, you know, like the publisher will send you something, or, you know, you'll like someone as a gift will get it framed, and you go like, I did it, you know, like and then it's cool. And then what happens is if you keep doing it, if you keep doing good work, then you get more of them. Yeah. And then you're like, now I just have a lot of this shit. Yeah. Right. And what are you supposed to do with it? Because you don't want to get rid of it because it feels like it means something. But it doesn't. Yeah. And it's just like another framed thing that only has significance to you. Yeah. And so to me, it kind of the as I've done this now a long time, the accumulation of like mementos or commemorations, it's kind of the physical embodiment of the baggage that the ego picks up. Yeah. You know? Yeah. And the stuff is just kind of rattling around physically when you move, but then also mentally in your head. And yeah, it's not super conducive to just like being present and being content and just being a person in the world.
I think choosing your identity is really important too. I consider the core of my identity to be father, husband, and not author. And I think I would be okay at some point in the future, not in the near future, but at some point being like, I'm done writing books. That was like, I'm not an author. That's not core to my identity. It's a thing that I did that I'm proud of, and I like doing it. I'm glad I did it. But my identity is father, husband, and like that's the core of who I am. So I think no matter what you do, I think like everyone has their identity, but like choose what you want to be very carefully. I think if you tie yourself to things that you either don't want to or can't do indefinitely, you're setting yourself up for some phase of misery.
Cheryl Strayed once made this distinction between writing and publishing, which I think is really important. So if you're, and then my friend Austin Kleon has talked about this, like, you know, are you the noun or the verb? And so if your identity is the verb, that's great because you can keep doing it, professionally or not, right? If your identity is that you love basketball, well, you can play basketball a long time. Yeah. If your identity is NBA All-Star,
I win championships.
Yes, that is much less in your control. And I think the Stoics, the whole point of Stoicism is like where are you in relation to things that you control versus things that you don't control? Yeah. And so, yeah, sure. Look, the identity of a basketball player can get taken away by an accident. Yeah. But that's more rare. And also there's still ways you can relate to the game. You know, you can still be a dude in basketball, whether you're playing or not, right? Because you can participate in the universe of the thing. But if you have associated your identity or your self-worth with the recognition for that
you're getting it. Yeah, that's really core. But let's say, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but let's say in 30 years, you're writing books and they're selling 2,000 copies. Nobody's paying attention. Would you still enjoy writing it?
Well, that's the question. Do I like writing? Yeah. Do I write because it brings me some sort of satisfaction or relief? Does it help me figure things out? For the most part, yes. Yeah. I mean, would I write differently if no one was reading? Probably a little bit.
If it was just a diary entry.
Yeah, I would. But I also journal every day, right? Yeah. Like I have been sitting down and trying to arrange words in an order that makes sense to me since I was in my room in high school, right?
Yeah.
Like it's always done something for me. It's done different things for me in different ways and at different times. But yeah, fundamentally, I like doing the thing. And there's probably some universe where if you're selling 2,000 copies, you're telling yourself, oh, it's going to be appreciated. Like I'm sure the mind finds a way to rationalize that it's different.
Yeah.
But I do think I would still be doing it. And one of the things I think about when I make decisions, I go, one of the benefits of this profession is that you can do it forever. It's like investing. Yes. It's not like music or like sports where the public is judging you harder as you age, right? Or the environment is harder to keep up as you age. I could literally do this till I die. So I've tried to make better decisions about how I can be more sustainable in what I do, with the idea that I do want to do it for a long time.
I mean, you're on at that rate, you're on track to write roughly 17,000 books.
Yeah, it would be probably too. But I actually think about that. Like when I open like an academics book, for example, and there's like 500, it's like also by
books of different, yeah.
I go, these can't all be good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so I was like, at this pace, I'm going to be that person.
Fiction is probably an exception to that. I think there are people who've written 50 fiction books, James Patterson, John Grisham, that can all be great.
Sure.
But if you need to do deep research and be some sort of expert on your topic, hard to write 50 nonfiction books that are all great.
Yeah. And so I was like, okay, I should probably slow down a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I do think about it that way.
So now you're at 1 a year instead of 2 a year, whatever it be. I'm kidding.
Yeah, probably. I took an extra year on this one I'm doing right now. But yeah, it's that is the question. Do you do it because you love it, or do you love what the thing brings you?
Yeah. You and I have talked about J.D. Salinger before. Mm-hmm. And my understanding, I might be getting some of this wrong, but he was a very mentally disturbed person. A lot of it was PTSD and alcoholism, but he was,
also a pedophile.
All kinds of all kinds of brokenness. My understanding is he was, one of the best-selling published authors, but then after he got kind of sick and just like went off the reservation, got sick of the industry, he kept writing for himself. He just never published it.
Yeah.
But he kept writing maybe every day, just loving putting words together. And that is really fascinating to me, that he's an example of just someone who loved writing, but got sick of writing for other people. Just wanted to tell his own stories.
It seemed like he hated his family. And you know what I mean? It was this escape from reality, which is probably not healthy. I just read this book called Furious Hours, which is sort of a true crime book, but it's also about Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, and the sort of she was going to write her next book about this murder case in Alabama, where this preacher was killing everyone close to him for insurance money. It was this like wicked, insane case, not far from where she grew up, and the writer's just talking about this sort of crippling perfectionism that besets Harper Lee, plus probably some alcoholism, plus she had this weird like aversion to paying taxes, and she was like afraid if she made more money she'd have to pay more taxes, which is again
that's a tough mindset.
It's something people should never think about. As the Stoics say, you pay your taxes gladly, but the curse of being so successful right out of the gate it sucks from her the love of being able to do the thing, and to do the thing not always at your best, right? Like the curse of perfectionism says that this is the standard, and anything below the standard is worthless. Yeah, and that's not true. If To Kill a Mockingbird is one of the great novels of all time, something half as good is still really good. And so part of doing anything sustainably is being kind enough to yourself to not expect you to be anything other than a human being. Yeah. I mean, if you think about the authors who have written 30 or 50 books, John Grisham, James Patterson, there's a very clear hierarchy in there, whether it is sales or just your own opinion. If you've read all John Grisham's books, you're like, some are amazing, some were duds. Yes. That's true for everybody. I'm sure with you don't have to name them, but there's a hierarchy within your own books, within your own head. Yeah. And maybe it doesn't correlate with the sales. It might correlate with your own view of it. Mm-hmm. James Clear and I were talking about this recently too, that if you write a lot, there's going to be a natural hierarchy, and you just have to put up with that.
that some books are going to sell better than others. You're going to be prouder of some than others. And that's just a reality of what you're doing. You can't write smash hit after smash hit after smash hit that are of equal quality, of equal reception, of equal sales.
Well, I bet it's probably hard for him. James is already a perfectionist.
Yeah.
Right. And just putting out his first book was very hard for him. Like, it took longer than it was supposed to. It took longer than he probably wanted to. And I know sort of right up until the last minute, he was like tweaking. That's how so for it to then come out and set an impossible bar. Like, I heard someone go, they're like, that song wasn't a hit. They were like, it was a freak.
Yeah.
Right. And there's actually that seems like it's dismissive, but there's actually a lot of freedom in that. So to go, that book or that project or that company that I did, that wasn't a hit, that wasn't a success, that was a freak, is a way to free yourself of the impossible expectations and burden of what you did the first time, and to go, okay, I'm just doing it again, and that there's zero chance that it will even approach where I was before.
Yeah.
But it's still worth doing. And so I can imagine following up something like Atomic Habits. It's like impossible. And so you can't.
Yeah.
You can't try to. And I've been lucky in that a lot of my books popped in many cases well after they'd come out, and I was already on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
So what they represented or the success they had, it not only was a conclusion slow in coming. It wasn't even something I was thinking about, because like I had a contractual delivery date that was more important, which is also what someone like John Grisham does. John Grisham, and I've worked with his agent before, and actually I did the marketing on one of his books many years ago. He's like, I start a book I forget what it is exactly, but it's like, I start a book in June and I turn it into the publisher in August and it comes out in March. And that's my life.
That's just what he does.
And so when you're like, some are great, some are not, it's like,
he doesn't care. He's got his
lined
system.
up in 2016, and in 2017 it didn't, and then 2018, 2019, 2020 he was on fire. But it's a process that is independent of him as a person, or as his identity as a person, and that is how he is able to do what I think would otherwise be crippling, or you'd be too self-conscious about.
Yeah. I know F. Scott Fitzgerald is another great author who was just mentally crippled at his own success too. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of like that early success, having it early on. And if you have the kind of personality that you're like, nothing short of what I did the first time is going to be good enough. A lot of founders fall for this too. Mm-hmm. If you're a first-time founder and your first company is a big success, and then you're like, I'm going to start another company. Yeah. Like the odds are never in your favor. Even if you are successful the first time, your second company is probably not going to work. No matter who the founder is, no matter what you're doing. Yeah. That's always the case. And I think it ruins a lot of them. It gets back to like big success early on, either early on in your age or the first time you do something, can be like a hidden curse. It's a very first world problem to have, but it is kind of a hidden curse to have.
So speaking of books, you had a great line. You said, I'm going to read more books and less newspapers.
Yeah.
And that changed your life. Why?
It was, books are more likely to be, not always, but more likely to be timeless, whereas newspapers are much more likely to be almost entirely based off something that happened in the last 48 hours. I used to be a columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and one of the things that the editors would always say, I would turn in a column and they'd say, hey, cool column, but what does this have to do with the news this week?
Yeah, where's the news hook?
Where's the news hook? And I would always be like, it doesn't, and that's why I think it's good. Yeah. In my view, like if you wrote something, a book or an article, if it was not relevant 10 years from now, it's not relevant today. That's always how I thought about it. Mm-hmm. And I never, like I always wince a little bit at authors who write a book that's like, has a time limit on it about like who's running for president this year. Like you stand no chance of selling one copy 2 years from now. Right. No one's going to read it. And so I think books are just, they're more likely to be timeless in it. And you're more likely to read something that will be as relevant 20 years from now as it is this week. Nassim Taleb has this quote when he's talking about authors. He says, to write a book that people will read 20 years from now, write something that people would have read 20 years ago. Like you just have to find something that's timeless. And I think both of us, the work that we do is that. It at least stands a chance of someone buying it 20 years from now and liking it.
But I think this is relevant about the information diet, right? You're saying like, you know, you remember very little of what you read, you know, from the New York Times 10 years ago, but you could at least name, you don't remember that much that you read from books 10 years ago, but there's at least some recall.
Well, I can't name a single article, a news article that I read 10 years ago that is on my mind at all. It's completely out of my memory. But I can probably name 10 or 20 or more books that I read 10 years ago and at least give you like, oh, here's the 3 things I remember from that book that stuck with me. So it's just much more likely to be timeless. I also think since it's a longer format, you're more likely to take it seriously. A lot of news, I read the news every day.
Yeah.
I still do. But it's a skimming process. It's just like skimming down, be like, oh, there's an interesting sentence. Okay, move on. I'm not interested in any of this. Books, you're like, I bought this book. I paid $20 for it. I'm going to sit down and take it seriously.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a huge part of it, right? It's like it was free because it's not worth that much.
Yes.
Right? Or it was cheap because it's not worth that much. And it's not like books are, insanely expensive, but you pay most of it up front, right? You pay the purchase price and then you got to spend, a certain number of hours with the thing to get the idea. And it's kind of a slow release tablet, and so the chances of that information having a longer half-life are much higher. And the chances of it pertaining to something that has a much bigger impact on your life are higher, right? Because you're not going to write a book about what happened at a city council meeting, right? You're going to write a book about something that has to do with human nature.
Or maybe the history of the city council. At least it's a little more, it's broader.
Yeah,
I also think a lot of, and this is no disrespect to them, it's just how the industry works. A lot of journalists write because they have to fill a quota. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily that like this journalist thought that this topic was the most important thing in the world. It's probably not the case. It's they have to publish twice a week. Whereas most authors are like, this probably was something that was really, that they had been thinking about for years. Yes. And of all the topics they could have picked, they picked this one because they thought it was the most important. Yes. It's just a more thoughtful process.
Well, yeah, they had to spend so much more time with it also.
Yes.
Right? And they spent time with it with the idea that it'll spend a good chunk of time out in the world, as opposed to, this is what we know about this right now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think about this as a blogger and a book writer. It's so easy to take risks in a blog because I can be like, look, if this sucks, it's gonna like people just move on from it. But a book, you're like, look, this is gonna sit on my mantle for the rest of my life. You really got to put your work and make sure that this is the good one that you're putting out.
Yeah, you only get a handful of swings.
Yes, it's a much higher lift.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there are lots of shitty books and some very good news articles that have been written. It's not a black and white thing. I just think your odds of learning something that will stick with you are much higher in a book.
It is interesting, right? Like you have elected leaders, you have CEOs or whatever, and you go into their office or you look at their information diet, and it's terrifying how much of it is based on real-time information.
Yeah.
Right? Like CNBC is running in the background, or Fox News or MSNBC is running in the background, and they're just mainlining like opinions about real-time events and developing information about real-time events. And it is true that, yes, they have to make a lot of real-time decisions, but they also have like real-time reporting, like from intelligence agencies usually, or people on the ground. But for the most part, their presidency or their legacy is going to be impacted by big macro decisions
they made with information that came in over the previous 10 minutes. I remember Obama was talking about when he was working with his book agent for his book. The agent was like, we need to move on this very quickly. And Obama was like, in my world, very quickly means in the next 3 seconds. Yeah. It's like we need to authorize this attack now. So he was like, tell me what you mean by very quickly. Do you mean over the next 6 months? Because my definition is different than yours.
That's true. But I mean, they're making decisions that actually would be best informed, not without the real-time data, but be best informed by 3,000 or 4,000 years of human experience.
Yes.
That they are not consistently reading about because the president would be mocked for leaning back and putting his feet up on the Resolute desk and reading a book.
But that would be the best thing to do.
Yeah,
absolutely. I remember back to like the short-term information. I remember hearing for the nuclear strikes that if the president was told, Mr. President, there is a nuclear missile coming in from Russia, do you want to launch a retaliatory strike? He has 60 seconds to make that decision. Yeah. and the information might be completely imperfect.
Yeah.
And he's either, if he says no, the US might get wiped out. If he says yes, he might wipe out someone, and you have 60 seconds to make that decision.
Yeah.
So I understand why in that world you would be drowning in short-term information, but you also want like some long-term wisdom in that person as well.
Well, no, it's funny. Like most people don't read, right? And then people who read a lot, like when Obama does that, book list every year or whatever. And even then, that list, I would say probably 95% of that list is books that came out that year.
Yeah.
Like when people do the best books I read this year, and there is this implicit assumption that when I say my favorite books of 2024, I'm supposed to mean books that came out in 2024.
Yeah.
As if I've read everything up until this point and I have the luxury of just getting caught up. It's like I have such a pile to dig through. So like I would say at least 50%, probably more like 60 or 70% of the books that I read, even the books I sell in my bookstore, are really old.
Yeah.
Like and my bias is actually towards like the older the better.
Yeah, I mean the time tested.
Yes.
And really when you see a book list of like my favorite books this year and it's all new books, really what that shows is like that reader, whoever it was just impacted by the marketing that happened that year.
Yes.
Like you read that book because it was being marketed heavily because it's a new book.
Yeah, and I say this as a person who puts out new books. Like, of course, I want you to buy the book when it comes out, but I'm also, as a reader though, I'm like, I'll get to that later if I get to it, but I want to read all the books that I haven't read. There's a quote from Truman. He says, "The only thing new in the world is the history you have not yet read."
Yeah.
And so if you've not read the book, it is a new book.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like it cracks open the same way and the pages are stuck together the same way as like a new book. It was probably printed, unless it's out of print and you're buying some used copy or whatever. It was probably printed just as recently as the new book that you're reading, right? Because they're selling out of it because it's still relevant and it has real staying power.
I know the book Endurance about Ernest Shackleton's voyage. It was either first published like in the 1920s or someone else wrote the exact same story and it went nowhere. Nobody cared.
Yeah.
And then it was either republished or maybe it was a new book recently that exploded. It's phenomenal.
Sure.
So I always wonder like, what else is out there like that? A book that was published in 1920 that nobody knows about, nobody cares about, but it's phenomenal. And there are so many out there.
Well, one of the books I raved about, and like we can't keep it on the shelf at the bookstore, and the printers always having to print more, is so Tolstoy writes this book called The Calendar of Wisdom. And it's just a collection of his favorite quotes from Thoreau and the Stoics, from Christian thinkers, from Eastern thinkers, and then he's sort of meditating on them. He wrote like a page a day book. But he writes it sort of near the end of his life. He's obviously most well known as a novelist. And then he dies and the Soviets suppress the book. So it basically is only rediscovered like in the late 80s, early 90s. And obviously I had not read it. I didn't read it when I was a kid or something. But then I discovered it and I was like, this is amazing. This is a book that for almost 100 years, no one was allowed to read.
Yeah.
But it's totally timeless. It's like fresh out of the vault because it was relevant when it came out. It would have, almost everything in it could have been written 100 years earlier or 1,000 years earlier. And so, yeah, there's tons of things out there that you don't know about, but it's actually the perfect thing for the scenario that you are in because not that much has changed about being a human being in all that time.
I also think there is a truth that writing styles change dramatically over the generations. So if you read a book that was written in the 1920s, you know the language that it's going to be written in. Long paragraphs, dense sentences, big words, some of which you don't even understand. And if that person in 1920 were to read a book that was published in 2024, they would be like, what are these short, snappy sentences? So like that style changes. So I understand why people might gravitate towards newer books that are written in a style that they're more familiar with.
But when you read real classics, what you tend to find is that person was not out of step in their time, but they went to what is fundamentally human and interesting and timeless, right? So Hemingway is, of course, a groundbreaking stylist, but at the same time is going to the essence of what he's talking about, right? He's stripping it down as opposed to sort of building it up. When you read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, you're like, oh, this is just a person talking to himself the way that people talk to themselves, which is not sort of long-winded and pretentious and
but is the Meditations translation into English, is that the key that made it readable?
There are, of course, better translations than worse translations, but even if you get like a George Long translated in the 1800s, even if you read, like I have some from like the 1500s, yeah, sure, there's thou art shall whatever, but like Shakespeare's tough to read, but also one of the most quotable people in the English language because when he's on to something, he gets, he goes, kill all the lawyers, right? Like that is such he's capturing a frustrating part of the human experience that was true in the 16th century and it's true now,
the
right?
Truth is still timeless.
And so even though he's speaking in an archaic language, when he's getting to the essence of what he said to be or not to be, even though the play itself, you might need a teacher to walk you through it, or it might seem a little accessible. The great lines in it, the great passages in it, band of brothers, those core things, he was getting to the essence of something, and you could have a 9th grade education and still get what's there.
Yeah. There's so many examples of like great Russian novels that are translated into English, and the translated version is not that great. You just can't recreate the quips and the turns of phrases once you translate it. The one standout there is the book Sapiens, where it was written in his native Hebrew. And then when it first published, my understanding, and when it was published in Hebrew, it sold okay. Yeah. And they translated it to English, and it's one of the best-selling nonfiction books of all time. So I think now 30 million copies. Did he write it in English, or did someone translate it? I think it was translated. And I think it was just one of the best translations that's maybe ever existed. And you compare that to all the Russian novels that are, as I understand, just incredible in Russian, but in English, they're like, it's okay at best. And I think that's more likely. With my books, I'm sure you have this experience. Some of the translations of Psychology of Money are amazing, from my understanding, and some are not. It's kind of hit or miss. And I can't fact check, was this Korean version done well? I have no idea. I just have to take the faith that you're going to do it well. But so much of what makes writing great is the turn of phrase. It's the unique word here or there that doesn't really translate perfectly.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love to do with Meditations is I'll take a line that I love and I'll go, I want to look at 5 translations in different eras. And you realize, okay, first off, our understanding just of what he meant evolved over 1,000 years. Yeah. And then also from each translator, it evolves. What they saw, what stood out to them, there's a huge amount of room for interpretation for something that we think is pretty straightforward. Like this word means this word in this language, so therefore.
But back in that era, it did not.
Yeah, and expressions and idioms and cliches and allusions. These things all evolve also, and so you realize that there's a metaphor for life in there, which is that. Many different people over many different points in time will understand the same thing very differently.
Yes.
And that is the magic of the classics, of course, that, this meant this to this society, which meant this to this society, which means something now to this society, and that it changes and evolves. But and so that's kind of destabilizing a little bit, but it's also really empowering because you go, oh, actually, I myself, just the same as all, I have the ability to interpret it differently. You can pick up something new from something that human beings have been talking about for 2,000 years. And this is what they call the great conversation, right? Like the great conversation between the classic texts and the people and the society that are relying on them and using them and making stuff from them. The founders meant one thing in the Constitution, and Lincoln decides, no. The fundamental founding document is the Declaration of Independence and the idea that all men are created equal. That's not in the Constitution. Right. In fact, the Constitution says some people are worth three-fifths of other people. And Lincoln manages to see that, and he makes such a cogent, compelling, and aspirational argument to it that millions of people fight a very deadly war to rewrite it essentially in blood to mean something else. And then Then there's a battle over that afterwards when he dies, and this is what we call the lost cause. And then someone like Martin Luther King comes, equally steeped in all these classical texts and the founding documents, and he makes such a compelling, beautiful argument that actually, no, Lincoln had it right, that he convinces a country that's effectively half racist at this time, probably more than half racist, that no, this is right. And so the ability to take something that has not changed and change it or orient it inside a story, that's really powerful. You say this in the book, the most powerful story wins, right? Like the ability to understand a story and to tell that story, that's how change happens, perceptions shift, and the world gets remade.
Yeah, I think wherever you look, in business and politics, wherever, it's always the best story wins. Yeah. It's not always the best decision or the right answer or the best answer. It's the most compelling story that you're telling. I often think about this with books too. I can't track down who said this, but I can't take credit for this, that people don't remember books, they remember sentences. I think that's really true. Even for the best books, I'm like, oh, this book changed my life.
Yeah.
I can probably tell you 3 or 4 lines that really stuck with me, that when I read it on the page, I had to stop and be like, oh, yes, like that's the thing I've been looking for. And so even within a great story, it's usually a couple lines that just like really move the needle for you.
No, stories are more powerful than anything. I mean, that ghoul, Stephen Miller, when he was in the Trump administration, they were trying to do like one of the Muslim bans or one of those horrible sort of xenophobic, racist laws. Someone goes, what about, give me your poor, give me your huddled masses. They start reciting the story that's on the Statue of Liberty. And he goes, that's not a law, right? Like he's like, that's not in the Constitution. And he's right, but he's also wrong, because the lady that wrote that, and she wrote that as a poem to raise money. But she was sort of motivated by an understanding of sort of Jews fleeing Europe, and she writes this beautiful poem to raise money to build to erect the Statue of Liberty. But that story is so powerful, and it touches something in what we want to be true about ourselves, that it feels like something that has been codified in law, because we all have agreed more or less on that, the sentiment in that thing. And then it was true. People were passing by the Statue of Liberty. And so it felt like, oh yeah, we all agree this is how it is, because that's how our grandparents got here, our great-grandparents got here. And it has no binding force other than the fact that it's aspirational, compelling, beautiful idea.
We've all agreed on it. It's equivalent of like a handshake law. It's not written down, but we've all agreed that this is what we're doing.
Yeah. And so when people want to effectuate change, I think they sometimes fuck up because they come up with things that are not great stories, or they're complicated stories, or in other cases, they're actively bad stories. Like the slogan is demonstrably false or demonstrably dangerous, or strikes people in a way that gets their reservations up, and it has the exact opposite effect of bringing about potentially real or meaningful change.
Yeah, I think you see this a lot with academics who are discovering incredible things in all kinds of disciplines, and the vast majority of them are terrible communicators.
Yes.
And in the white papers that they write, they're just writing for other academics. If you and I pick up a cancer research report, we more or less can't make any sense of it.
Yeah.
And it's tragic, because if you take all of that information and those discoveries and give it to a good storyteller, there's so many world-changing insights in there that just gets lost amid a jumble of terrible writing and acronyms that nobody understands. ChatGPT is actually very good at this.
Really?
To upload an academic PDF and say, summarize this for me in layman terms. It's actually very good at doing that.
I mean, COVID's the quintessential example of this. Like, the CDC is putting out these like charts, and you have to go like,
like no one's understanding.
And no one's going to do that.
And you compare that to Steve Jobs saying 1,000 songs in your pocket with the iPod.
Yes.
Like he could have said digital MP3 player for the next generation. But like, no, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Like you can't beat that.
Yes.
Winston Churchill's another good example of someone who, by all accounts, was a terrible politician in terms of like actually like moving the needle politically. Like couldn't do, but he was one of the best orators of his time, one of the best writers of his time, got people's attention, which is what you needed during that era.
Yeah.
You didn't need someone who was necessarily making the best policy. You needed someone who could make a speech to get everyone fired up and moving in the same direction. And he was the best in the world at that.
Well, the obstacle shows the wayness of Winston Churchill is first, he basically has these horrible parents who abuse him and don't love him, or neglect him and don't love him. So he's forced to retreat into books and ideas. That's where he finds happiness and excitement, and it's a bigger world than the world that he lives in. So that's his sort of first. And then the second is because they basically blow his inheritance. He has from an aristocratic family, but he doesn't have any money.
Yeah.
He has to make a living as a writer.
And he's buried in debt.
And he makes a lot of money as a writer. He's one of the best paid writers in the world, ultimately. And then when he is kicked out of power in the 1920s and 1930s, he has to really go make his living as a writer. And he loses his platform. He loses institutional power. And so he has to cultivate power as essentially a media personality. He has a radio show, and he writes articles, and he writes these books, and he builds this enormous platform. He's actually more famous in America than he is in the United States in the run up to World War II. But because he's talking to people about these ideas over and over again, not only does he figure out really how to express them, and he gets the truth of them, he's one of the only leaders with like the time to read Mein Kampf.
Yeah.
He knows so he's taking Hitler literally. And then he understands that this is a battle of ideas. And so when he comes back to power, he's not just, he's prime. He is the man is meeting the hour, right? Yeah. In the truest sense of the word, in that he has developed the exact media skills, the exact background. He is perfectly formed to do this thing. And if he had gotten what he wanted all along, he wouldn't have done it. He would have probably been like every other politician. If he'd been in power, he probably would have made the same mistakes that they had made. So we have this sense that like we want things to be a certain way. And it may well be that the circumstances that you're in are perfectly forming you for some moment that you can't anticipate.
Yeah, I think it's true for all modern politics. There's the famous JFK-Nixon debate, which was the first televised debate. JFK understood how TV works. He wore makeup. Nixon was like, none of this matters. And it was like, that's what changed the election. And also whether it's Reagan or Obama or Trump, no matter who it is, they're all extremely good at communicating what they want. Sometimes the ideas are better than others, but they're extremely good at saying, this is where we're going, and getting people involved. Hitler may be the best example of like the most atrocious ideas of humanity, but saying them in a way that got millions of other Germans to be like, yeah, sounds good, let's do it. So I think like the power of storytelling can be incredibly powerful on either end of the spectrum. It can be devastatingly powerful. It can be incredibly powerful for good on either end, but it's almost never the middling, just good idea, right idea, told poorly that's going to change the world.
Yeah, and it's never the idea that is most morally correct or the most complete.
Yes, like within the best context. It's always just like a slogan that people are like, "Yep, sounds good." Yes. I think at its core, this is true for writing too. It gets down to how impatient most people are. Of just like, I don't have time to sift through all the details of your 50-page PDF. Yes. Give me the 2-line summary of what your idea is. And if that 2-line summary, they're like, love it. Then they'll remember you. They'll buy your book. They'll go for it.
Yeah. Well, it's also though, like, it's not that people won't read a 15-page PDF or they won't read a 1,000-page book. They will. It's just got to be really good.
Yes.
Right. And so like people will engage with complex ideas if someone can create a world in which that it is in their interest to do so, in which they are pulled from sentence to sentence or idea from idea to idea, right? Yeah. Like people will fight in a multi-decade war about something if you have made it clear why they should do so, and you've given them something that sustains them through that. And the problem is most people go, I'm right. This is obviously good. I care a lot about this. And what they lack is the empathy, the ability to understand what you need to get someone from the beginning to the end. They have to be pulled along or motivated along. Yeah.
I forget if it's David Perell or Jack Rains who's made this point that they push back on the idea that people are interested in short-term content, and that's all they'll consume is short-term content. And I forget, Jack or David says, that's not true at all. They'll watch a 14-hour series on Netflix. Mm-hmm. They'll binge it. They'll watch it 14 hours straight because it's a good story. Mm-hmm. It's well done. What people have no patience for anymore is like rambling, incoherent, long form content. That is completely gone.
Even in short-term video, you think, oh, a minute. It's because people will sit there for a minute, and they won't. Actually, like, as I see this on the Reels for Daily Stoic or Daily Dad, like, you actually have like 2 seconds or you have 1 second
to catch their attention.
So it's not that they'll watch a minute. It's that if you capture them for 1 second or half second, if you get them at the beginning, they'll make it through to the end. And it's the same is true for a book or for an idea or a movement or a company. If you can create something that is immediately compelling and then moves someone along through a process, or in sales they call it a funnel, that can work. But if you don't have the immediate grab, the thing that provides a compelling reason or a way into something, you're dead.
Who was a guy on YouTube who made those ads, welcome to my garage kind of thing?
Ty
Who was
Lopez.
Those YouTube ads, some of them were like 15 minutes long. The ad was 15 minutes long.
Yeah.
But the first 5 seconds, you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
You're going to take me into your house and you got a Lambo sitting there? They were so compelling that I think a lot of people actually watched all 15 minutes of that ad.
Yes.
It's like an incredible thing to do to make it that compelling.
Yeah. And part of that, what he's doing there is being fundamentally shameless.
Yes.
He is capturing something that most people are not tapping into because you'd be too self-conscious.
Yeah.
Right. And this is where demagogues and charlatans and people come in, is that they're often willing to do things that other people would be too self-conscious to do.
Yeah.
And so for people who are not astute or people who are naive, they don't understand the distinction. So that seems like what a wealthy person would do.
Yeah.
Of course they wouldn't. That seems like what, that person has a lot of books, they must read a lot. That's sort of not how it goes. And so there's sometimes they can sometimes in the short term, capture a certain amount of attention or build a sort of insipid movement. But Lincoln's thing about you can't fool all the people all the time. Eventually it comes out because there's no there, right? But in for that capturing the 1 second of attention or even 15 minutes of attention, it can be quite effective.
I think there is some exception to it, particularly in finance, where there are pundits who have been wrong their entire career, and still get people to line up to listen to them. Because I think to some extent, if you tell people what they want to hear, you can be wrong forever with no penalty or very little penalty.
You have to ask, what are they do? What is the maybe you've heard this in therapy. A therapist will say something like, I have this problem, I have this belief, I have this pattern that I do, right? And they go, what is that doing for you?
Yeah.
Right? Because there's almost nothing that we do on a regular or consistent basis that is not serving some purpose for us. That is not
they're telling people what they want to hear.
Serving a function in our life, right? Yeah. And so it seems bad that you overcommit or you do all this stuff, and you go, but it's salving some wound or it's keeping me busy. It's serving a function for you. And so, a financial pundit who's wrong all the time, what at the most fundamental level, are they entertaining? Right.
So it's not most of them are pessimists, and there is a big market for pessimism. And I think for a lot of people, the reason they want to hear pessimism is because the only way to deal with their own personal inadequacies is to fantasize about a world in which other people are suffering too.
Yeah.
So they fantasize about the economy collapsing. They fantasize about the stock market collapsing. And when there's a pundit who says big crash is coming, then that person who is kind of stewing in their own inadequacy is like, yes, other people are going to suffer too. I want to listen to this guy.
So that person's not actually providing financial services.
They're providing like a therapy for them to,
but it's masquerading as
financial advice.
Yes.
Yeah. But there's so many of them who've literally been wrong for 40 years and still sell a zillion newsletters per year.
Yes. Well, and you sort of, once you listen to someone and they're wrong enough times, you now have now there's another purpose, which is now we have sort of your basic cognitive dissonance here. Now, do you want to be the person who was an idiot for listening to so-and-so?
Yeah.
Right. This is why people stay in cults. This is why people don't change their identity, because to admit that one was wrong or that one was taken or that one was manipulated or that one was, naive or whatever it is, that's really hard to do. So that person who has this thing that's fundamentally, always going to be attracting people, is like predicting doomerism or extremism or whatever the thing that's drawing a certain percentage of the people in. You do that long enough, a certain percentage of those people are going to stick, and then once they've stuck, they can't leave.
Yeah.
Right. And so you've just accumulated a base of just people who
it's part of your identity.
Yes.
There's this incredible story from the Heaven's Gate cult, who I think all committed suicide later. But at one point in their cult, they believed that a spaceship was going to come in to save them. So they bought a telescope to look for the spaceship, and they point the telescope to the sky. They see nothing. They take the telescope back to the store where they bought it, and they said, this telescope is broken.
Yeah.
And the store said, oh, is there something wrong with it? They said, no, but we didn't see the spaceship that's coming, so clearly the telescope is broken. It can't see the spaceship. Like at every level, just stewing in their own bullshit and incapable of getting out of it.
There's a great book, I think it's called The Big Con. It's all about how con men operate. And I didn't, you think a con man is just like ruthlessly and manipulatively tricking people. And it's much more complicated. First, the con has to, there's that saying, you can't con an honest man. First off, the con has to catch someone who is interested in getting away with something or getting something for free or finding a shortcut. So first off, you self-identify or offer yourself up to be conned by putting yourself in a vulnerable position. But the part that I didn't understand that was sort of really, I think, illustrative is what happens at the end of every successful con. So like in the 20s or whatever, they'd be like, we're gonna fix a boxing match, right? And so they'd get someone to put up the money to help them commit a con, right? We're gonna fix this boxing match. And then what they would do at the end, actually the boxing match is fixed, but in a way they don't understand. They'll have like one of the fighters pretend to kill the other fighter. Like they'll have it go horribly wrong. So then the con man and his partner, who's actually the mark, flee in different directions.
Yeah.
Right. The exit from the con is the part that a great con man figures out.
Yeah.
They have to understand that you have to give the person a way out to separate from yourself. So it's important that you realize, like, when people are caught in a bad political movement or a social movement or some investing cycle or a cryptocurrency or whatever it is, first off, they were vulnerable because they believed it was possible to get something for nothing, or that they could break the rules and get away with it. And then where you tend to meet them is at this part where you're trying to convince them that they're in the thing.
Yeah. And
they can't, because they don't have a way out that doesn't make them feel stupid.
Look dumb. Yeah.
And so what the con men figure out is that's why they have to have a way that they both flee, so that person doesn't go to the police and get the police to investigate. So they want that person to have some kind of guilt that makes them stay silent with it.
Maybe that's why Ponzi schemes can be so successful for so long, is because you're constantly giving until it ends. Everyone has a way out. You want your money back? I'll give you your money back. There's always a way for them to leave the process.
And they don't want to see, even as the evidence is adding up that there's something off about this, it's weird, to admit that to yourself would mean, first, admitting that you fell for a Ponzi scheme. And then two, mean that the gains that you have so far are illicit. And that if you try to get out, you might not be able to get out by the time the whole thing collapses, or that in getting yours out, the whole thing collapses. And then, so you're caught up in it. Even at some level, you talked about, like, you don't know why you walked away from that moment. You didn't go skiing again. It could have, you're probably experiencing some existential dread or doubt at some level you don't understand. And that's also what's happening in people. Like, they know this marriage is bad for them. They know this thing isn't working, but they just can't get out, because to get out would mean facing some real dark shit about themselves or the world.
I was asked not too long ago with my skiing incident whether I had survivor's guilt. And I said, I think survivor's humility is a better word. It's like, I never felt guilty about it, but it's just like a stark example of just like, man, there's so much out there that's out of your control that I didn't realize at the time. And I think that's probably true for some people who got caught up in like Madoff's Ponzi scheme, of just like understanding that something you thought to be true and a decision that you made, you thought was a good decision, to in hindsight be like, it was actually completely different than I thought. It can be a very jarring experience.
Yeah, I mean, I have that. I worked for a couple different people who sort of built these kind of cults of personality around themselves. And I was in it, but also out of it at the same time. And so I do have a certain amount of empathy for the people who are still in it or are still falling for it. I get it. I get what part of yourself that person is manipulating or inflating or helping with. And then, you have to have the sense that it very easily could have gone the other way. If you were one different thing that happened in your childhood or some event, you could have been open or vulnerable to being sucked in more fully in a way that could have changed everything.
And the truth is, you and I and everyone is sucked into some sort of bullshit movement right now, whatever it would be that we don't know.
Yeah.
Everybody is to some degree, whether it's the political party I affiliate with, whether it's the identity I face as an American, as a white male, whatever it would be.
Sure.
Like we're all just kind of mirrors of what we've experienced, and we don't realize for the most part how unique the experiences that we have had are relative to everybody else.
Well, the Joan Didion line, and this is actually her table, the Joan Didion line is we tell ourselves stories in order to live.
Yeah.
And people, in the way that things become Instagram quotes or things that, they say at a wedding or something, we've taken that to mean that humans are storytellers or something. She means we fucking lie to ourselves so we can live with ourselves.
Yes.
It is a dark ass quote, right?
Yes, but it's so profoundly true.
That is what humans do. We tell ourselves stories so reality can seem somewhat stable, right? So that it is not the incredible mess of contradictions and hypocrisies and terrifying prospects and uncertainties that it undoubtedly is. You can't wake up and not have some story about who you are, why you're one of the good guys, and why things are going to get better, or you can't function without those stories. So we are lying to ourselves.
There's a thing in psychology called depressive realism, which basically means that people who are clinically depressed make better predictions about the future because they're more realistic about what's not in your control, how corrupt the system is, how evil people can be. They're more realistic about it than you and I might be. And I think that's a lot of it. Like people who wake up most people who are not depressed need to wake up and be like, I'm a good person. The system's good. This is all going to work out. Even if it's not necessarily true, you have to tell yourself that just to get out of bed in the morning.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, because it's not far from the absence of those stories into some kind of nihilism. Yeah. And that's not a great place to be.
But you don't want to be the depressed person, but they're more realistic about how the world works.
Yes.
So I'd rather be blissfully ignorant, happy.
Yeah. That's an interesting part of the book. Obviously you talk in both your books, you sort of talk about what it means to be wealthy or successful, right? That's sort of what we're all aspiring to. And then how few successful or wealthy people would measure that success or wealth in any kind of happiness or contentment, which of course is the thing that matters. There's that Naval Ravikant line, I think, if you're so rich, why aren't you happy?
Yeah.
Or if you're so smart, why aren't you happy? You could break it down with any kind of adjective is that's what we're all working towards. And then you end up hitting a different target.
I think there's a truth too that humans are wired for status. They're not wired for happiness. And status, there is an element of status within happiness, but only to a small part. So people, I think they're just naturally wired to say, I would rather make a lot of money than be happy. I would rather live in a big house than be happy. That's how they've been wired. I think it's true just from an evolutionary perspective of it's a competition for resources. Happiness does not play into that. What matters is that you get the land, you get the mate, you get the job, whatever it's going to be. So they're wired to chase that, not necessarily happiness. To achieve happiness, to chase that requires going out of your way to ignore what you might be naturally pushed to gravitate towards and be like, I could make more money. I could work longer hours, but I just want to be happy. I just want to hang out with my kids and go for a walk and go kayaking. Right. And you really have to fight back against the natural urges that you're moving towards.
Well, I think the trouble is the other things are much more defined. They're much more attainable in the sense that they are concrete.
Quantifiable.
And usually a product of very specific actions.
Yeah.
Whereas happiness is like a reputation or something, or respect is a byproduct.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not a thing that you really pursue. And so we tell ourselves, I'm doing X, Y, and Z because I think happiness will be a byproduct of that.
Yeah.
Even though historically there's not much correlation. In fact, there's the opposite. Like I was thinking about, we all kind of know like extreme wealth tends to tear apart families, tends not to make people happy. You know, the plot of the TV show Succession, or really any historical or literary work, right?
Yeah.
And yet, what are most people working on and then secretly hoping for?
Yeah.
That their company isn't just pretty successful, but is transformatively successful.
Right.
They're hoping that the lottery ticket is like the big winner. They're hoping that the book sells 1 billion copies, right? Like deep down, we are hoping for a thing that we know will be ruinous.
Yeah.
And it's a lie.
I think that's just how we're wired, though.
Yeah.
It's how we're wired. Like, I wrote about this recently. Among the top 10 richest men in the world, there are a combined 13 divorces. And 7 of the top 10 have been divorced at least once. It's a very small sample size, but like for a statistic that is so critical to your lifetime happiness, among a group of people that are so universally admired, I want to be a centibillionaire. It's an interesting thing. I was just like, you take these guys who are like everyone wants to be, but if you actually dug into their lives, you're like, I don't know, is it that great? It doesn't seem that great. They have no privacy. They're constantly being harassed. Most of them have been divorced at least once. They're working 100 million hours a week. I think most people, if you actually put the full context of what their life is like, it's back to the Elon Musk quote of like, you might think you want to be me, but you really don't.
Well, and divorce is just something that, since it's a legal status, it's pretty, measurable, right? How many of them have relationships with their kids? How many of them
things are less quantifiable?
Know the names of all their grandchildren or their spouses, right?
Yeah.
It would probably bring you to tears.
Yeah.
The human wreckage accumulated there in the, say, top 10 richest people in the world. And so that should be like a warning, I think. But also one of the things that I try to think about is I go, let's say you have a happy marriage, you have a relationship with your kids, or you have a job that you enjoy. You go, I have a thing that money cannot buy.
Yeah.
I found this as an author. I would just, you meet these really successful people as they read your books, and like, you think you're going to learn from them, or you're going to talk about them and all this stuff. And then you find out secretly they just want to find out how to write books. And you're like, wait, that's what you want to do? I thought
you're already successful in your own thing.
Yeah. And actually they don't like that thing that much, and they want to do this other thing because they think it's more meaningful to them. And go, I had to stop as I was interested in all these other things when I was going to start this company or do this. I go, wait, I have this thing that billionaires can't buy. It's like there's a line in the first episode of Yellowstone. Kevin Costner's character is like getting in his helicopter and he's telling his son, who's like the lawyer, he says, if someone had all the money in the world, this is what they would buy.
Yeah.
And he was trying to remind himself, like, I have it. And obviously the tragedy of that show is basically him destroying himself to expand it and to keep it exactly as it was, instead of being like, I'm the luckiest person in the world.
Yeah.
And so that's the tragedy, I think, of a lot of these people, is that they have all the money in the world, but what they fundamentally want, what humans want.
Not only do they don't have it, they can't have it.
Right.
Because what they might want is privacy and autonomy and whatnot, or time with their family.
They want things that fundamentally you could never buy with money.
Yeah.
Happiness, being a good person, relationships, feeling like you're enough.
Yeah.
Like something broke in them when they were 7 that made them feel like the only way to feel good is to be a billionaire. And then it turns out actually being a billionaire doesn't address the 7-year-old wound.
Yeah.
And so that's the tragedy.
The other thing is, like, Two stories from Bill Gates have always stuck with me. One is that he worked 7 days a week for 25 years, didn't take a single day off in a quarter of a century when he was building Microsoft. Yeah. The other that may or may not be true, but is a great story, is that he removed the radio from his car because when he was commuting to the office, he did not want any distractions whatsoever. He just wanted to think about Microsoft and nothing else. And the idea that he might be able to listen to the radio for 10 minutes was like, no, I don't want that distraction.
He was depriving himself of the ability to do a human thing.
Yes, because he just wanted to think about Microsoft and nothing else. And when I hear things like that, I'm so glad that he exists and people like him exist because they create these things we all benefit from. My second reaction is I would never in a million years want that for myself.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to like, when you're looking up to these people, you might be like, oh, it would be so great to be worth $100 billion. That would be so amazing. You're like, the sacrifices that came with it, the life that he had to live is very different from my definition of a successful life. When I think about a successful life, it's time with my kids, it's time outside, it's helping people, it's sleeping in, it's exercising. It's not working 7 days a week for a quarter of a century.
Sure.
So just
you people will go, oh, well, he hit the lottery in all these ways, right? He was born at this time, born on this street, had this lucky break, started this company, whatever. But you hit the lottery, you as an ordinary person, in so many ways, in that you were not fundamentally broken in that way.
Yes.
Not Bill Gates specifically, but any person for whom there is essentially never enough. The insatiability or the ambition or the compulsion to do and do and do that makes someone a conqueror or Julius Caesar, 2,000 years ago, or makes them a Wall Street baron 150 years ago, or a billionaire, a tech billionaire today. You hit the lottery in not having to be that.
Yeah.
You don't think about it that way, but you did.
Like, I'm so glad that I was not tortured to be the kind of person that would work 7 days a week for 25 years.
Yeah. Lincoln said he had this engine of ambition in him that knew no rest.
Yeah.
And if to have no engine of ambition at all is a terrible curse. To have one that knows no rest, and actually Lincoln wasn't being fair to himself, because he wasn't a Julius Caesar or a Genghis Khan or even a Nixon, or wasn't fundamentally broken at that level, because clearly he cared about certain things more than himself, right?
Yeah.
But if you know the engine with no rest, that's a curse. And then even if you're someone like I would, if I'm there's a spectrum between those two. I'm not even in the middle. I'm more here, but it has some. I've found some breaks for it, right? Like I have some control over the speedometer. I can't get it to zero, but it's not broken it's not fallen out of the other side of the speedometer either, right? And to think like, oh, you have the luxury. I mean, think, obviously someone who cheats on their spouse is not a great person, but very few of us go like, I'm glad I don't have whatever the genetic cocktail is that makes
somebody do that
harder to resist, right?
Yeah.
Or that something didn't happen to me as a kid, or the way my parents were, that makes me think that that's okay, right? Like, so there's so much you can be grateful for as a person about what you have, that we often skip over when we are jealous of people that if we actually knew what it was like to be them, you would not want to.
Wouldn't want to do it. I was talking to someone last night, and this is a somewhat related point, that if you were a previous alcoholic and then you went dry and you're like, I haven't had a drink in 20 years, and huge congrats to that person. But that person, by one definition, is still an alcoholic, because alcohol still controls them. The fact that they say, if I had one drink, I might fall again. Alcohol still controls them.
Yeah.
And our thing was like, you're only not an alcoholic if you can drink once in a while and it doesn't control you.
Yes.
And I think it's the same with money as well. Like, there are a lot of people where their money or their ambition owns them. They don't control it. It controls them.
Yes.
I think this is really true for ambition. Mm-hmm. Go down that list of centibillionaires, Musk, Bezos, Gates. I think ambition controls them. They don't control it. It is in full control of their personality. And that is a thing that I would not want for myself. I think that's a curse in many ways, to not control it.
Seneca was talking about this Roman general named Marius, who's the most successful, like, sort of politician, general, strongman in Rome's history, probably. And he says, Marius commanded armies, but ambition commanded Marius.
Yeah.
Right. And so that fundamentally he was not in command of himself. Right. And which the Stoics would say is the greatest empire. Right. So there's all the people that want to control this plot of territory. There's all the people who want to control this market, control this product, this position of power. And then how few of those people are in control or command of themselves. They're slaves. Epictetus is in the court of Nero alongside Seneca. And he realizes, yeah, I'm a slave. Right. I legally do not own myself or my labor. But he kind of looks around and he goes, I think I might be freer than most of the people here.
Yeah.
Because I don't want anything from these people. I can live within my means. I control my emotions. I control my thoughts. I'm not a slave to my passions. He basically realizes that there's different levels of slavery. And of course, the fundamental legal or form of chattel slavery is this grave injustice that no one should be subjected to. But then there's also these self-imposed forms of slavery that sit above it. And we don't see those people as fundamentally unfree, but they are not free.
Yeah.
That was a definition I heard of addiction, which is you lost the freedom to abstain.
Yeah.
You don't have a choice about whether you do it or not. Because
But
you're not in
maybe also
control.
the freedom to do it if you wanted to. So the person who cannot drink, are they still alcoholics because they don't have the freedom to have one drink if they wanted to? Like they're still being controlled by it.
To me, that's what that quote means.
Yeah.
They don't have the freedom to not do it or do it.
To do it. They're still controlled by it.
It's not in, but even putting aside like the mantras of recovery, that doing it or not doing it is not a choice that they have.
Yeah.
They are under the compulsion of their thing. And so they can build up edifices or programs or commitments, or the law can make it harder or easier for them to do it. But they are a slave to that thing. And I, from my understanding of addiction, this is a thing that sort of you get a gene for, and then that gene gets turned on or off depending on your upbringing. So it's actually important that we make it clear that this isn't a willpower issue. Just like, Elon Musk isn't waking up and going, I'm going to be a bigot today, or an idiot today, or I'm going to cause chaos today. There is something that has, sort of broken inside of him, or broken its bounds inside of him, and he has lost the ability to corral that. He's still ultimately culpable and responsible for the damage and the consequences of that. And it is a salvageable situation. It just would demand him first admitting that he's not in control.
Yeah. And I do think everybody is addicted to something that they're out of control of. I was just thinking, so much, and I'm sure it's true for you and every parent, so much of my happiness is going to be tied to my children's happiness. If they're not happy, really hard for me to be happy.
Sure.
But what if my two children have that genetic cocktail that is going to lead them to misbehavior, and they end up getting arrested, or whatever it might be? So therefore, like, I'm tying my happiness to something that's out of my control. Yeah. And in a very similar way of just like, I'm just kind of crossing my fingers and hoping that this all works out.
Yeah, there's a saying, you're only as happy as your unhappiest child.
Of course. Yeah.
So to have children is to fundamentally make yourself vulnerable to them and life, right? Your heart's running around inside this other person. But I think Stoicism, I think also just healthy boundaries. You do have to cultivate you have to go, yes, I am inordinately attached and irrationally attached to this person. That's what having a kid is. But you also have to cultivate this kind of, you have to go, yes, but like their job is not a reflection of me. How they're doing in school is not a reflection of me.
Yeah.
Them being depressed, obviously you're going to feel that, right?
Yeah.
But it's not your job or your place or in your power to make them undepressed, nor did you make them depressed, right? All you can do is be there and be of service to them.
Yeah.
But if you as a parent think that you have the ability to control your kids in terms of make them what you want them to be, or save them from the shittiness that is being a person, you've set yourself up either for unhappiness or
I think it's
'Cause you
really
better
hard
hope it
too
goes a certain
because
way.
it evolves as a parent. So when you have an infant, when you have a newborn, if that infant is hungry, that's the parent's fault.
Yeah,
And if your 2-year-old has a dirty diaper, that's the parent's fault. So you create this sense of everything about the child is relied on me. Their happiness, their unhappiness, it's all about me, the parent. But then as that child grows, then you have to detach yourself from that. And if your 25-year-old child is depressed, it might not be your fault whatsoever. But you still have that parental feeling of like everything that's going on in your life is a reflection of me, the parent. I think it's hard to evolve like that.
Yeah, no, and that's like basic boundaries and codependence that you have to learn as a person. And the tricky thing is, because humans develop, a good chunk of our development is outside the womb, but we're still fundamentally dependent, developing like organisms, right?
Yeah.
Like a horse that comes out and it can walk like 30 seconds later, right? But for a kid, that's like 2 years. And so, when do they become the second person?
Yeah.
And I think, if your idea is that that's 18, you done fucked up. And you know what I mean? It's it's both earlier and later than you think.
And this is probably why parenting a young teenager, like 12 to 14, is probably so difficult, because I think for a lot of people, that's the clear transition from child to young adult.
Yes.
And it's probably very hard for the parent to let go of the idea that I'm not responsible for your happiness anymore.
Yeah. And that actually I have to allow you to be unhappy. I have to allow you to fail. I have to allow you to experience the consequences of your actions. I have to allow you to feel and say things towards me that are
I don't want to hear.
incredibly painful and hurtful. And if you can't do that, you are not only first off, you're just depriving them of the ability to do this, and you're not saving them from anything. In fact, you're just setting them up for intense pain and anguish later. Like have you read Dr. Becky's stuff?
No.
She wrote this book, Good Inside. She's incredible. She's saying, parents, your job as a parent is not to preserve and protect your kids' happiness. It's to give them resilience and the ability to regulate and handle their own emotions.
Yeah. And find out who they are.
Yes. And so if no one looks back and goes, my parents saved me from heartbreak and pain and trouble and self-discovery and all the painful things in life, and I'm so grateful to them.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's the opposite. You're going to be 30 and be like, why am I experiencing this horrible thing for the first time?
Yeah.
And I don't, it's like I didn't develop the immunity for it. She even talks about this idea of emotional vaccination. You have to help them deal early on with exposure to these things so then they can regulate and do it themselves. And so, your job is not to raise happy children. Your job is to raise well-adjusted children. And you can use some version of that expression for pretty much everything that parents wrongly value. Your job is not to raise kids with good grades. It's to raise well-adjusted children. It's not to raise well-behaved children. It's to raise well-adjusted children. Like the whole point is to ideally raise a person who's well-adjusted, able to regulate their emotions, bounce back from failure, deal with things that are outside their control. It's just the whole suite of what allows humans to be humans. So actually, you have a great line in your book. You talked about prediction versus preparedness.
Yeah.
So if you think your job is to predict all the terrible things that could happen to a person in life and to shield your kid from them, you're missing the point.
To prepare them for that anguish.
Exactly.
The other way I've heard this phrase is your job as a parent is not to raise good kids. It's to raise good adults.
Yes.
Like that's the target. And you're going to raise a good adult if as a child, that child can experience heartbreak and failure and et cetera, et cetera. You've written the book.
Well, no. When I sign copies of Daily Dad, because the subtitle is 366 Meditations on Parenting, Love, and Raising Great Kids. Usually when I sign it, I'll grab it and I cross out kids and I just write adults.
Adults, love it.
Because
perfect.
That you're not trying to raise a kid. Like if you do this for 18 years or 20 years or whatever, if they're still a kid, again, you done fucked up.
And everyone knows the 35-year-old kid.
Yes.
And I think that can be a reflection on the parent.
Of course.
Of what the parents didn't let them experience.
Yeah, you were supposed to raise a well-adjusted adult, not a kid.
Not a kid.
And age really, after a certain point, has nothing to do with whether someone is an adult or a kid, a man or a woman or a child, right? Like
Yeah.
it's about the suite of skills that you have and how you see yourself and how you hold yourself. And that ultimately is what you're supposed to do as a parent.
I also see this. I mean, you will understand this. Every parent understands this. I have 2 kids
Yeah.
raised by the same parents in the same household with the same rules, the same everything, and they could not be more different. Their
Yeah, sure.
personalities are 20 miles apart.
Yeah.
And then so you see so clearly like what is not in your control, what is nature nurture. They've been nurtured the exact same way and they are utterly different people.
Yeah.
So then it's like it's a humbling experience in a good way to realize like what's not in my control. What is just the genetic soup that they were born with that I can't control about
Right.
them.
So if you're trying to raise 2 professional golfers or 2, executives to take over the family business, whatever, you're going to be sorely disappointed. You have to zoom out and go, what are the things that across the spectrum of humanity, all different people, different cultures, what are the things that happy, successful, resilient people, what do they share in common?
Yeah.
And that's one of the few areas that you have a little bit of control as a parent, or
takeaways.
that's where you should spend your attention.
Yeah, absolutely.
You want to go check out some books?
Let's do it.